Uh, a warm welcome to you all. Welcome to the 5th Madras Month presentation brought to you by the Roja Muttaya Research Library and the Foundation for South Indian Studies. A quick word about the two organizations. The Roja Muttaya Research Library provides research materials and facilities for research scholars of Tamil studies in a variety of fields spanning the humanities, social sciences, sciences. With a collection of 4 lakh items, Roja Muttaya Research Library is currently engaged in digitizing its entire archive. The Foundation for South Indian Studies works in the area of arts and culture, seeking to engage, educate, and present various aspects of the region's culture. So let me first introduce Bhooma Padmanabhan, and she will take it from there. Bhooma Padmanabhan is a Chennai-based curator, researcher, and art program manager. She has done her MFA in art history from MS University, Baroda. She's worked at the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art, FICA. At FICA, Bhooma has experience in working with some of India's most exciting young artists, supporting critical art projects and on public programming and educational outreach. Bhooma has since curated numerous contemporary art exhibitions and has experimented with the curatorial art space as platforms for learning, resource sharing, and collaboration. In 2018, Bhooma was a researcher with the Kochi Biennale Student Biennale program. Bhooma is now the co-curator of the 3rd edition of the Chennai Photo Biennale. So now over to you, Bhooma.
Hello. Hi, am I audible? Okay, thank you, Anita, so much for the introduction. Thank you, RMRL, for inviting me to moderate this session by my dear friend, Krishnapriya. I worked with Krishnapriya in the past, and I think the closest we sort of worked together was during the 2018 Student Biennale program, where we did this fantastic 1 week long workshop in Chennai with the artist Sanatanan. And actually that sort of has allowed me to see her practice at work because to sort of call Krishnapriya a curator is a very sort of unidimensional way of introducing her. Her practice is involved and committed. She works closely with a whole group of other artists in the city. So just to introduce her quickly, she is a practicing visual artist, again based in Chennai. She herself is a student of the College of Fine Arts in Chennai. In her practice, she uses paintings, drawings, collage, found objects, and sculptural installations. And her work primarily deals with the self and her relationship with the environment, with her own environment. History and local political discourses are also woven into the imagery that she creates. She's also very interested in understanding the process of art pedagogy and is also very interested in contemporary art practice, history, theater, and environmental studies. She's participated in numerous exhibitions and art camps, and she's also part of a few art collectives in the city. Krishnapriya was a curator in both editions of the Student Biennale in Kochi in 2016 and 2018, which is 2016 version being the space where she actually started working on this labor project. She was also a resident artist at the University of Pennsylvania in the fall of 2017 and again in the summer of 2019, which was a program supported by the South Asia Center at UPenn. I would like to call upon Krishnapriya to make her presentation. So basically today's session is going to be, we're going to ask Krishnapriya to present her paper, followed by which we can, both of us will sort of speak a little bit about the project and about the School of Arts Madras and its long and complex history and how it sort of persists and, molds artists and the visual culture in the city and elsewhere even today. And then in the end, we'll open up the session for Q&A. Thank you, Krishnapriya. Over to you.
So, hello everyone, good evening, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Anita. Thank you so much, Bhooma, for introducing me. This evening, I'm going to basically talk about a project that a group of us actually worked on. So this was a project that was part of the Students Biennale 2016-17 edition. And so that particular edition was a very interesting Students Biennale edition, where it had a parallel engagement of working with young curators as well as working with young student artists. So there were 15 of us involved in that project, and we were sort of on a very ambitious project of working with around 56 colleges, particularly government institutions across the country. Oh, 1 second, I'm just having some trouble. Yeah. So, and we were particularly, I think the Students Biennale is really interested in working with government institutions and not so much the private art institutions. So this project was for most part supported by the Tata Trust, and it was also a year-long engagement. So the entire year of 2015, for all 15 of us, was in engaging with student artists. So I worked with 3 institutions: the Government College of Fine Arts, Chennai, Government College of Fine Arts, Kumbakonam, and the College of Fine Arts in Trivandrum. And out of this, what interestingly happened with the college in Kumbakonam and Chennai was that we were able to form a collective of around 30 students, and the 30 students together engaged in various degrees with the question of labor, and also primarily looking at the history of the institution itself. So in many ways, the Chennai College and the Kumbakonam College have several overlaps. They've had several teachers who've worked in these spaces, and these colleges are connected in many different ways. And so the whole exercise of the curatorial for me became a research-based project, where I was looking at also, having studied from the Chennai College of Fine Arts, I was deeply interested and intrigued by the history of the college, and also someone coming from Chennai, and the history of its colonial past has been something that is very interesting for me. So I was approaching the institution through this lens primarily, but it was not only thinking about the history, but also thinking about the present, the students who actually study in these institutions today. In many ways, it was also thinking about what I went through as a student in this art institution. So my presentation today is more or less going to be a quick glimpse into the project that we did. And in many ways, the project weaves the idea of the city inside its content. It talks about stories of labor. It talks about individual engagement and tensions within the space today. And in many ways, the college and its history reflects its regional political trajectory as well. So so I'm just going to show you a few slides, and from there we can sort of take it forward. So the Government College of Fine Arts today was originally an industrial school that started in 1850, and was also started by a British surgeon called Alexander Hunter. And it started as a small institution, but then it moved on to the present campus, which is on Pundamalai High Road, next to the Gandhi Urban Bridge. So this slide here is even today outside of, on the facade of the college wall. And this used to be the original entrance of the institution, but of course today the entrance has been shifted. So these slides are in a sense to give you all an idea about the architectural element of the institution. So interestingly, this famous red building, as we call it in our college, is designed and constructed by Robert Chisholm. And he went on to sort of pioneering in the idea of the Indo-Sasanic architecture. And in many ways, this building was designed in a way for artists and be it painters, sculptors, to work within a studio-based practice. So, for example, you can, so this is the view of the building from the Gandhi Urban Bridge. And then this is the entrance to the building. So this building also houses a very interesting library that has an interesting archival collection. And then, so this is a facade of the sculpture building. And so this slide is sort of what the studios looked like. So it in many ways was a futuristic architectural intervention where light was something that architecturally was thought about. So the rooms would always be flooded with a lot of light. And in terms of space, in terms of, you know, I mean, easily a whole lot of artists could parallelly work with each other with a lot of room. And this slide here is the sculpture department and the sculpture studios, where again, these windows were very interestingly placed, where the room was usually flooded with a lot of light. So in many ways, the idea of a studio practice engaging with modernity was something that architecturally the college had sort of was thinking about. And interestingly, this was also a space where a lot of elements that were used in the Indo-Sasanic architecture were developed. For example, a lot of the stained glasses that we see in a lot of the buildings in Chennai, and a lot of the ceramics, a lot of the wrought iron were cast here. And it's not just Chennai, because Robert Chisholm sort of went on to making a lot of other Indo-Sasanic buildings, not just here in Bombay, in Trivandrum. Yeah. So this particular space became the most interesting point of reference for us, or in many ways, the beginning of this project. So this is the locked up museum inside the red building. And luckily, I mean, we were all very lucky to go in and see this building in the last Chennai Photo Biennale. I mean, they got permission to open up the space, and there was an active exhibition in the space, which we were all, as students, ex-students, very happy to engage with. Otherwise, when I was a student, this was just a space where you would have to sneak peek, or you'd have to find a window, and then you'd be on tables or stools, and then trying to see what was inside this museum, or what was inside these glass vitrines. And for the longest time, I think there have been a whole bunch of stories and a whole bunch of I would say myths about what was inside this museum. And because it has been closed for a very long time. And within the college also today, the actual archive is locked up inside a room, highly protected with a big lock, with the government seal and all of that. But we would always keep imagining what could have been inside these glass vitrines, and what could have this museum been like. So the original entrance was one end of this museum, where people could enter into the museum and then enter into the institution. So for us, we were definitely thinking about the museum as a site. So in terms of if today we were going to keep something inside the museum, if today we were going to activate the museum, what would we put inside the museum? What are the objects that we would place inside? And that's where, in many ways, the idea of what if we created a labor museum came about. So, of course, I think for most people in Chennai, and I suppose in India, would know the Triumph of Labor. This was sculpted by D.P. Roy Chowdhury, and this sculpture was sculpted in the Chennai College. And so there are, again, very interesting stories associated with this. Anecdotes of how D.P. Roy Chowdhury made the sculpture. So, for example, he used two models for the sculpture. So one was an attender, and the other was a student, and he used both of them as models. So this sculpture was placed in the Marina Beach in Madras in 1959 to commemorate the first May Day celebration that happened in Triplicane in Chennai, and also in many ways to commemorate the first labor union that was formed in the country. So the first labor union was formed by the Biniyan Carnatic Mill employees. So this statue has several other meanings to the city itself. So there's, of course, I mean, I remember growing up watching Tamil movies, and this would be the first image that you would see in a way of introducing the city itself. And of course, today, I suppose the meanings of the sculpture has changed quite a bit. And in many ways for us, again, this sculpture, the Triumph of Labor, was also a point for us to think about the question of labor and what the statue actually means for all of us today. And who were these people? What do these bodies mean? And what was the ambition, or what was the idea of nation building that this sculpture represented? So again, this is an original brick that still is there in the College of Fine Arts. And even as a student, I was totally fascinated by this brick. So this is in many ways an evidence for that remains, that sort of opens a whole history about the industrial school, the labor that had gone into building of the city. And this was also the first standardized brick that was made. And the entire red building was built with these bricks. And I think all of the Indo-Sasanic architecture locally was also built with this brick. So for us, again, this brick became a symbol in many ways for us to think about labor and to think about the college's history and how through the years this history has shifted in many ways and what it is today in its present. So this is sort of an overview of the actual exhibition that happened in Kochi. So again, as I was telling you, this was a year-long process where we, the 30 students at different levels, along with some of us, we were trying to engage with the question of labor and the college's history. We were doing different exercises, engaging with different ideas. We did several field studies, and we were collecting different sources or different layers to the project. So in fact, what I'm going to be showing you is just a glimpse into the project, because the project is in many ways a very layered project. So we also, as a final exhibition, were not able to fully exhibit the entirety of the research and the work that we had developed, but it was just a part that we exhibited. So this exhibition was the exhibition that happened in Kochi. It was there for 3 months as part of the Students' Biennale. And then later it traveled a bit. It went to Mumbai. It was part of Kalpana, an exhibition that the Tata Trust had initiated. And then later we brought it to Chennai. We exhibited this collection in Spaces. where I think in many ways it was an engagement for the students and the city locally. And it opened a lot of interesting perspectives for us. So again, this is another image of the exhibition. So this is also another, so what we were also trying to think of with the project was we were trying to think about all the different engagements that went on within the College of Fine Arts, which is, it started as an industrial school, but went on to thinking about craft as a very important element. So for example, this textile piece here was done by a collective, a group of students. So they worked with the natural dyes, primarily coming from Kalamkari. So interestingly, the college had a textile department where weaving was actively done. They also worked extensively with indigo dyeing. They worked with natural dyes, and of course there was woodwork. There was metalwork, there was jewelry making, and all of these departments as such were later formed as more concise programs. And so in a way, we were also trying to think about all the different materials that the college's history had. So textiles was one of the things that we were thinking about. So this is basically a sari that documents women and labor, and also the question of childbirth and why childbirth is called labor, for example. So I think there were a whole lot of questions that were constantly coming up. So the question of what is art, who is the artist, was also something that as a collective we were trying to engage with. And particularly over time, even when I was studying, we were in these different departments as such. So for example, I studied painting, but there was painting, sculpture, printmaking, ceramic, textiles, and crossovers were rarely happening, so this was again something that we were also questioning through the project. So what does material and medium mean within contemporary practice, for example? And can we all as students or like ex-students or artists be restricted only to particular mediums that we engage with? So this is a work that was done by Sindhuja, a student artist at that time, and she comes from a family of weavers. So this was again a very, very interesting aspect that came out of the project, which is the question of where the students come from and who are the students who actually study in the college. And this is something that I've been personally very curious about. And so Sindhuja comes from a family of weavers. And it was not just Sindhuja, but a lot of these students actually come from craft families where weaving is still practiced, woodwork is still practiced, metalwork is still practiced. So it was largely students who were coming from craft families, and for most parts, the students were also coming from very difficult, hard labor backgrounds. So a lot of them were also first generation learners. So this is the work that Sindhuja did. This is silk thread on silk, and she has done portraits of 4 weavers, and 4 of them are from Kanjipuram. And again, the project also meant that each of these individual artists had to sort of explore their own histories, their own locations, and a lot of them actually traveled. So this became an opportunity for them to engage with the question of research and how they can document their own story and stories of people within their immediate experiences. So this is a work by Deepika. Again, interestingly, Deepika comes from a family of woodworkers, and she has never worked with wood, but this was the first time she was working with wood, and it was something that she felt naturally connected to. So interestingly, the College of Arts had a woodwork department, and in fact, in 2000, One, when the college was renamed as the Government College of Fine Arts, Chennai, that's when the woodwork department was closed, and it almost became a place where broken furniture was repaired. And interestingly, the Trivandrum school still has an active woodwork department. So um, it's also, again, these are evidences to think about how the college through the years also wanted to shift its position politically and socially as well. So this is a work done by Kameshwaran. Kameshwaran comes from Namakkal, and around where he lives, there are several brick kilns, and this entire book uh, is a large book that opens into drawings and documentation of these brick kilns from in Namakkal. And so for him, his question was, what does it mean to make a brick, or what is a brick maker an artist as well? So again, as I was telling you earlier on about, I think for us collectively, the question of who the artist is, what is our own engagement, and how do we, like, for example, even when I was a student, craft was not something that, so in fact, the year that I joined, the college was called the Government College of Arts and Crafts, and then the name shifted to Fine Arts. So what does that really mean? So where is craft, and how were the artists or the contemporary art scene sort of looking at craft in a sense? So this is a series of cyanotype prints that came out of a workshop. And so this workshop was conducted by Madhavan, who's a contemporary alternate photographer. So cyanotype is a very interesting early photography or print technique where the chemicals that are used react to the quality of sunlight that falls on them, and it turns these portions into a blue tone. So students basically used a whole bunch of tools, and it was domestic tools, their own artistic tools, sculptural tools that they used to sort of, so in many ways these were just these shadows or prints of these objects that were taken. So the college started in 1850, but within 4 years, 1854, there was a photography department that was already in place. And so photography in many ways, I think, played a very important history and role within the college. So in 1870, there was basically the Archaeological Survey of India. They wanted a series of photographs taken, and the commission was taken on by the College of Arts. And this was a process of documenting people locally and documenting culture, documenting stories locally. So the photographs that you see here are available online at the British Library. And one of the interesting things that we collectively wanted to do was to engage with these photographs. So what does it mean for us to today recreate these photographs? So students sort of posed, or they sort of position themselves within these photographs, and also to think about framing, composition, viewing, and thinking about the colonial lens itself. So this is a series of photographs that they recreated. So again, here, this is a group of woodworkers, and the photograph on the right is the students actually working for the project itself. They were posing while they were working. And so this gentleman here is Tiago, and he is a carpenter who also studied from the College of Fine Arts. Interestingly, his father was someone who would make frames and stretchers, and he had a small workshop within the college. And so So in many ways, we were also trying to bring people in who've been associated with the college. So this is a work by a student artist called Kamal. So Kamal had made friends with Sundar, who is a blind man, and he sells small sweets and trinklets in the MRTS, which is the train, the local suburban trains. And so Sundar was invited to the college, and he was taken to the sculpture department. He was given clay, and the question of who's the artist again was something that we were trying to engage with this project. And he was asked to work with clay and make whatever he wanted. So interestingly, he made a small sweet, a small barfi, and so the video sort of goes on to exploring how he engaged with a material that for really the first time he was working with, and the question of what does it require to make art, or what does it require to even view art, you know? So and the question of blindness and understanding art was something that we were trying to think through with this project. So again, this is a canvas that was painted by Movendran. Movendran was part of an exercise where a series of such paintings were done by different students. So this series was where individually each person was thinking about what their own imagined labor statue would be. And this was something that Movendran came up with. So the question of who is the triumph really for, and what is the missing link, or what is the missing story within the triumph of labor statue was something that he was thinking about. So the collective also created a series of artist books, and each of these artist books within themselves were in many ways artistic research was sort of engaged with. So we created a library of these books, and so we also made a bunch of library cards that documents each of these books. So here you can see one of these books, and this book was done by Talamuthu. Talamuthu basically documented the railway track cleaners in the central station. So again, the central station was a site that we were thinking about for many reasons. I mean, thinking about railways and its link with colonial history, and definitely thinking about manual scavenging and what happens to these practices today. So these two images are what were inside the book. Of course, I mean, a series of these kinds of images, particularly documenting the women who work, you know, in cleaning the tracks, the railway tracks. So this was a graffiti that we did, and this work was largely inspired by the artist Banksy, and thinking about graffiti as the history of graffiti, thinking about graffiti as protest. So humorously, this work was conceived where there is, you know, one of the four of the men actually step out to have tea, and so Workers of the World Relax was a text that came from Bob Black, an anarchist American writer. So this is a sculpture of Revati. Revati is one of the railway track cleaners, and she in many ways for us was the center of this project, you know. So the question of whose sculpture gets made, whose sculpture gets exhibited in public spaces was something that we were thinking about. And for us, again, thinking about the tradition of making sculptures, and particularly coming from an institution that was heavily interested in academic practice and sculpture making. We were also working with the industrial medium of fiberglass with the sculpture. So this is a sculpture that was sculpted by Talamuthu. And for us, if we were to think about a counter narrative to the triumph of labor itself, Revati's sculpture in many ways became that counter narrative for us. So today, if we were to sculpt someone, we would like to identify, or we would like to engage with who this person was, and rather than creating an image of a laboring body, is it possible to rethink how we see labor or something that we were visualizing? And so after the sculpture was made, it was taken to the central station, exhibited. Of course, you can see some of these images on the side, where the sculpture was exhibited in the central station for a few hours. It was photographed, and then this sculpture became the center or the core of our exhibition in many ways. So I think I'm just going to end my presentation here. So as I was telling you, this project is a very layered project. I mean, I've just given you a glimpse of what the project sort of was about. And in many ways, it has a lot of invested voices in sort of documented in it. Yeah.
Thank you, Krishnapriya. I actually wanted to just quickly sort of jump in there before you've finished your presentation to ask whether you can speak a little bit about the collaborators, the students who they were, what were their sort of areas of practice, so that we also get an idea of where these sort of choices of, whether to work with acrylic for a sculpture, or to whether to work with textiles sort of comes from, and also a little bit of the process of how you work as a group, because I know it wasn't something that an individual artist sort of went out and did. They were researching collectively, producing smaller works together, presenting it in the exhibition together. A little bit about that process would actually really help us think about why the kind of narrative that, or the counter narrative that you were trying to produce, how important it is, and what the struggles were to sort of find the voice.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of the students actually come from craft backgrounds, and it's also, I think, historically, the institution is also not very different from when it was started. So at the very beginning, I think there were these craftsmen who were brought, particularly from Kumbakonam, a group of craftsmen who were brought to do metalwork, and they were they were staying in Pudupete or Mannadi, Broadway, and then they were working in the institution, and they were brought in as trainers as well as people who would teach and also create artworks, curios that were exported or used locally within the city's growing consumeristic kind of need. And so what we sort of realized through the project was that the situation hasn't changed in many ways. So a lot of the students, so even today we have a lot of students studying in both these colleges, the Kumbakonam College of Fine Arts and the Chennai College of Fine Arts, and they also, after finishing their courses, go on to doing different things within the city's artistic space. And again, this definition of what the artistic space is something that, again, will not fall into the idea of exhibiting or studio practice, but then it's more of a larger labor need that the city has. So it could be animators, it could be of course the Tamil film industry is a huge space where a lot of these young artists sort of move on to work there. So the collective in that sense was a very, very diverse collective. So even just thinking about Kumbakonam and Chennai, so Kumbakonam, the college is set in a small town. It has all these beautiful fields, agricultural fields around it, and that's where the institution is set. And whereas in Chennai, it's right in the middle of the heart of center of the city. So it's quite diverse and dynamic in terms of the students and their backgrounds. But a lot of them were not really aspiring, or the aspiration to become individual liberal artists with their own perspectives within the idea of studio practice was not something that a lot of students were actually coming with, so this project in many ways was a learning teaching experience where they were engaging with a lot of these for the first time. And most of our sessions were workshop based, or it was also a lot of informal meetings. So we would just work together collectively. We would go see different places. So of course, within the 30 students, there was also a core group that worked on this project intensely. And so there were also layers to this engagement as students also. So for example, there were some students who just made who were part of the artist books, for example. They each created just an artist book. There were some students who were part of several of these collective works that I showed you. So for example, the fabric work, the graffiti, these were all collective works. Collective in the sense that they were, they came up with this based on engagements of where there were a lot of discussions. We were looking at archival material, we were looking at individual research, and then we would discuss, and these works would emerge from that process. And the actual production also was one that was very, it was a collective process in that sense, yeah. But yeah, the question of, so again, this is a very, very interesting question for me as well, which is we keep wondering about what happens to all these students who pass out from these institutions, and where do they go, and where do they fix themselves? Because within the city, it's, we know we do not have a very active contemporary art scene, for example. So then what really happens in these institutions and what happens to the students is something that is actually very, very interesting, and what choices they make is also very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, because I think that sort of the locating the institution within the city, I think is really important, because, for this presentation, I was doing a little bit of research, and honestly, a lot of it was very new to me, because, you sort of are fed this information about colonial art schools as being, as teaching a certain kind of colonial discourse alone, of naturalism and, a certain stylistic type as being preferred over the more decorative, ornamental Indian style of work. And one of the interesting sort of authors I read was one Dipali Diwan, who's a curator at the Royal Ontario Museum. And her sort of thesis is actually like a counter thesis of sort, She is actually talking about how, in fact, the College of Arts, the various schools of art, not just the Madras School of Art, but the Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, actually initially started with a really strong sort of need to revive what they call the industrial arts, which is the craft techniques, due to the contemporary environment in the second half of the 19th century, where they actually thought of these sort of craft skills as being something that was deteriorating in quality. And so even like early sort of records of Alexander Hunter sort of setting up of the school, there's a lot of effort that sort of went into identifying the fine arts department as being different from the industrial art department. So there clearly was the sort of bifurcation of what was being taught, and even in the curriculum. And actually, interestingly, the industrial arts students weren't apparently charged a fee. So it was free of charge. Education was free of charge for the longest time, because they actually wanted to encourage, not to everybody, but especially children of artisans, of craftspeople. So of certain castes who belong to, ironsmiths or potters or goldsmiths, their children were given free education, and it was something that was sort of part of the initial sort of founding statement of, what the College of Art was. Whereas that same excuse was used to keep certain sections of people away from the artistic department or the fine art department, like we might call it, by having a 1 rupee fee per month. So this was also sort of the idea of what is contemporary art or what is art, like you were asking, is also something really complex, because there was no singular definition of the kind of artists that these colleges were producing. The artist department had its own sort of mandate, and which also kept changing, and so did the industrial departments within the school. And I think that also sort of reflects a bit on like I think the name of the school has been changed like some 7 times since it sort of started, and every time this name of the school changes, you realize there's also a shift within the school sort of idea of how it defines itself. And that's something that that's actually really interesting to look into, because there was apparently a time under Robert Chisholm when the school was actually, there was a, he appealed to the committee to say, the school is not functioning the way an art school is supposed to function. He actually wanted it to be shut down. And then they did this whole sort of like, they played out the case and said, okay, fine, let's keep the school open. So it's obviously more than a singular sort of idea of who an artist is or what they are training there. And that's sort of been the case with the College of Art right from its early days. But what is interesting is sort of this narrative of the industry, of the laboring sort of artist, is, although it was sort of also foregrounded before, I think the more romantic notion of who an artist is something that we've inherited more today from the College of Art, and that's something really interesting. That's sort of that where we are not sort of looking at just a single trajectory, but probably look at multiple trajectories of how each department changed and how each principal sort of shifted the priorities of what the schools should be looking at. Having said that, I wanted to also speak to you a little bit about the question of labor itself, and how you sort of came upon labor. I mean, one is the D.P. Roy Chowdhury sculpture itself, but you were also looking at various other sort of histories of labor in the city, and it's something that's also ongoing in your interest, in your curatorial sort of research about the College of Art. Is that something that you'd like to share about?
Yeah. So looking at the history of the college, of course, E.B. Havel is also someone who's extensively written about the question of craft and, the way he imagined the industrial school to move forward also. So of course, he is a very important aspect in that sense. And of course, I think with D.P. Roy Chowdhury, I mean, one of the first things that we say is that he was the first Indian principal of the Madras school. And with him, I think in many ways, the imagination of nation building and, the idea of course, I mean, it's not just the triumph of labor that he sculpted, but in Madras itself, we have Gandhi, and then of course, the Dandi March. And so across the nation, his imagery plays a sort of very important role in the aspect of nation building. So the idea of modernity or the question of how we want to move forward was something, and how we want to move forward, also with the influences of the Bengal school, was also brought in with identifying the question of Indianness, or what is local, what do we want to represent and how do we want to present ourselves as artists, So there was a brief period of that kind of engagement. Of course, KCS Panikar plays a very important role in this narrative. There's Dhanapal, the sculptor, who again plays a very important role in this narrative. And then the question of regionalism, but not in a very narrow sense, but then, what is the political engagement, regionally, what are all the different discourses that are happening here, is something that was definitely documented. But I think over time, this narration has also shifted quite a bit, and to the point where even when I think I was studying as a student, we really did not have active artists. I mean, we keep hearing about how AP Santanraj was a teacher, or Alfonso was a teacher, and then how these artists who were also practicing artists engage with students, and Anthony Das was an amazing teacher as well. So, but then by the time we were students, which is early 2000s, there's already a time when practicing artists were not present within the institution. And I think in that way, these shifts were also quite sharp. The way these shifts happened have also been quite sharp. In fact, I think in many ways, it's just been a group of artists, or, single artists, and then their story, and then how they've individually shifted a particular space. Yeah, so that I think is it's this I don't know if it's been fully documented in this sense, but then it's a very, very interesting history to think about. But for most parts, I think for most of the artists and students, their narrative, it's just been a very quiet kind of struggle within the College of Arts, So the question of class and caste also plays a very important role in who actually, even today, who studies in these institutions, and who originally also came to these institutions. So it was definitely not a white collar job. It was, it was about the body laboring, and so who chose that profession is also something that I think is actively, even today you can see that actively being played out, and so the imagination of the artist, and so I keep thinking, even today when you go inside the college, there are a whole bunch of sculptures where the question of how the artist sees his own self, or how the artist sees his own body is very clearly and interestingly visible, so the imagination of who the artist is still remains, and when it comes to contemporary practices or interdisciplinary practices, this shift has been quite a struggle. To move away from traditional mediums of painting, traditional mediums of disciplined kind of practices, and how you view these practices, and interdisciplinary practices are definitely a huge struggle. In fact, I think one of the things that is actively being discussed right now among the artist community in Chennai is the change in the syllabus that has happened, and where most artists are questioning this actively, and who's changing the syllabus, what is happening, and how are we imagining the future for this institution, so in many ways the syllabus has just been imposed on the college, and we right now don't even know where this imposition is coming from, and so the question of Indianness has been enforced, and so whether within the institution students are thinking about this, or how they're imagining their own practices is actually quite different from the question of how I think or how I think the syllabus, for example, is being imposed on them.
Right. And when you talk about this sort of angst, it's also a certain imagination of who an artist is, and sort of striving for this, a space that probably doesn't exist anymore. But what about the actual there are a lot of students who actually made it out in the world, probably not as contemporary artists or, mainstream gallery artists, but they're sort of working in the creative industry and in various capacities. And that's something that's actually quite unique to the institution, because one of the things I think we have chatted about in the past is the fact that most of them become sort of active creators, you know, be it in the advertising world, in the film industry, and that sort of, what is the sort of feedback from that space, you know, once you get out in the world? What is there sort of a wave that comes back to the school in terms of alumni, in terms of, you know, visiting faculty? It's actually very interesting to sort of think about possible routes that, you know, the future of the college can take.
Right. Yeah. So I think in that sense, the tensions between these different practices are quite alive, you know. So starting from the question of art and craft, you know, fine art and craft, and, you know, where the fine artist is always imagined as this person who speaks from the self, you know, who has a liberal voice, whereas the craftsman is someone who's just repeating patterns or repeating something. It's, again, this is a tension that even when I was studying, this tension was definitely very much there, you know. So we were, as students, encouraged, not particularly by teachers, but then just as a community, we were constantly thinking about what does it mean to talk about the self itself, you know. And so we were all actively moving in that direction. But yeah, interestingly, this larger expanded kind of practicing creative people are definitely, they've come out of the college and of course in the film industry, and, you know, but I'm not entirely sure how these are coming back to the institution itself, because within the institution, I think the imagination of who the artist is, and these imaginations are also very fractured. They're not, they are in many ways isolated, and but then I think interestingly, so one of the things that we were always doing with when we were students was we would always be in touch with our seniors as such, you know. So our teachers were not the people who were actually designing or shaping our lives, or even designing or teaching us or talking about the course in any way. So it was always engagement with older artists, older students. And so interestingly, there was a possibility for us to do what we were all individually interested in, because the institution was definitely a truly diverse space in terms of practices and in terms of, so a lot of students, for example, one of the things that came up in the labor project was the signboard artist culture that is deeply sort of embedded in the history of Madras itself. So so a lot of the students, even my own classmates, would as part-time jobs go out and you know, paint or work with signboard artists. And so in fact, in the project, we had one student artist whose father was a signboard painter, and he did not study in the College of Fine Arts, but then he wanted, or he aspired for his son to study in the College of Fine Arts. And this is also in many ways to remove the stigma of the signboard artist, or like the self-taught artist, or someone who just is working for somebody else. But then whereas once you study, or once you go through the College of Arts, then you become someone who is individually creative, and then, you know, you have a very well defined self, you know. So this is so interestingly, this student artist, what he had done was he did a portrait study of his father, and his father did a signboard piece for him, you know, and this was sort of exhibited parallelly. So in that sense, the project also, we were also trying to bring in different people who are not formally considered as artists inside the project. And again, so within the city and within the social framework of the artists in the city, there are very rigid sort of boundaries, and there are a lot of tensions within the boundaries also, you know. So we sort of have these well-defined spaces, and in many ways the project was also trying to, you know, counter these narratives, you know, whether we could think about the idea of the artist, or, you know, even humorously we were trying to engage with the question of who the artist really is. Yeah.
Right, and one of the other things that I wanted to also speak about is the fact that the College of Art, unlike, say, you know, some of the other sort of more contemporary art institutions in the country, doesn't have a theoretical sort of an art historical section at all. So you have generations. So where does the discourse emerge from? Or is there an acknowledgement of the kind of discourse that's emerging at the College of Art? And who records it? Who's speaking for the college? And that's something that I think, from what I remember, we went back and forth without really knowing who speaks for the College of Art. And the sort of absence of a voice, of having to sort of think about the present, where the college stands within the larger sort of narrative of art schools in South Asia. And that sort of not being able to match the two is something that's something that we should really be thinking about more, considering the sort of, you'll be the first sort of institution, formal sort of art institution in the region, so to speak. Fantastic. Actually, coming back to the title of this paper, which is actually, creating a museum of labor, I thought it would be interesting to actually think about what the museum at the College of Art itself could have been. And like you said, it wasn't accessible. But, some of the things that I sort of found was actually really interesting, because you had Hunter, who was, paying an arm and a leg to buy these sort of Greek and Roman casts that were being produced in London to be shipped to Madras to be used as objects of study. And so initially the museum actually consisted of these objects of study. So it sort of becomes a arm of art education as such. And then with E.B. Havel, there's actually a paper where he says, I wanted to get rid of this museum collection, because he wanted a museum collection that actually acknowledged and documented the kind of rich history of what he defined as, fine art within India. So miniatures, paintings and sculptures from within the subcontinent, which he sort of later, and I think he was sort of partially successful in getting rid of the earlier collection and, adding newer, so more sort of Indian examples to the museum. So to actually think of the museum actually as a space which wasn't built with the intention of viewership, of the sort of viewer who comes from outside, but as a collection of objects which were actually meant for study. It was very much a part of art education, and not sort of it's not the other way around, like now, where you have a collector who makes a museum and then you have an art education sort of angle to it. This is the other way. The museum itself sort of emerged from the need to define what art education should be, and help the student. And so it sort of becomes props that the students use to learn and practice on. And actually, to bring that to your museum, your imagination of the Museum of Labor, I'm actually glad you actually spoke about that portrait in the very end of your presentation, to sort of think about, so this is not just an object of study, but it's also an object of contemplation, to actually think of the self and where the self stands and how we represent the labor and the laboring body and the laboring bust, so to say. Would you like to share a little more about that aspect of sort of what you thought of the museum or the making of a museum through these exercises?
Right. So, yeah, so thinking about the art history question, which is actually, yeah, it's quite interesting in that way. I mean, this is also something that we as artists in Chennai are constantly thinking about, and one of the first things that a lot of senior artists will tell you is that, one of the reasons why Chennai artists have not really moved, or their discussion hasn't moved to other spaces, is because we do not have a good art history department, But yeah, so that is in many ways true. I mean, we do not have an engaging art history department. And I would constantly, I think the reason is quite complex though. I mean, it's not just about, so again, I think it sort of goes back to the question of who actually studies in this institution, or who who aspires to study in this institution. So as I was telling you, there is the question of caste and class that sort of comes up when you start thinking about this, So for one thing that I know is when as a student, for a lot of, I mean, including myself, I think academic studying or studying was not something that was the most exciting thing, in the sense that even through school or whatever, we were just struggling through academics, and then art was something that gave us a voice, so. And I would speak on behalf of a lot of students who study there, where I think this kind of is a very interesting aspect that they all sort of have, which is that the academics or studying or formal education was not something that a lot of the students were actually interested in. So art sort of became this very liberal kind of freeing element, so and I think that sort of reflects in the question of the art history department, where we'd never really had students who wanted to study art history, or they did not come into the institution with the intention of studying art history. And in that sense, that area is largely sort of a muted kind of area, where the history of the college itself, in many ways, I mean, we still have a record of a very superficial documentation of the history, the artists, but sort of an in-depth, critical, analytical understanding of the artists and the history and the trajectory of the college is still to be documented in many ways, So, so of course, there is the aspect of the colonial industrial school, and then there is the aspect of modernity and the engagement of the self, and the aspect of who the artist is, that has been negotiated, and then the sort of expanded practices that students have sort of gone into. These are yet in many ways to be documented or critically to be looked at. Yeah, so I think I think it's a very interesting aspect that you shared, which is about Hunter and what he brought to the museum. In that sense, I think I would also view this museum as not one that was similar to a lot of the colonial museums, where it was about acquisitions, or it was about bringing what the native represented. I think the museum that was housed inside the college, it had a very, very different flavor. It was definitely about education. It was about, the community of artists, and, what they were engaging in, and in a reflection of this engagement. So the museum was, in many ways, all of that. So, so out of the few objects that I think some people have spoken about, some of the senior artists, or, so of course, when the floods happened in Chennai, a lot of the objects in the museum were actually out, and, they were put out to dry in the sun and all of that. So, that was a time when some people got a glimpse into what that collection was. So, for example, we have a very interesting textile piece, which is this beautiful sari that is woven with silk and silver, for example. So it's called Kodangi Karappu, and then there is of course a whole bunch of, I think, or at least there were a whole bunch of bronze casts and sculptures, So it's a very, I think the museum definitely was about education, and was about the community that was actively engaged, within the space of training, within the space of craft making, within the space of artistic imagination. So, but for us, I think for the project, it was just a point where, we were literally left with, as I showed you that photograph, where it's just an empty space, it's just this space that has nothing, but, and it actually became an exciting proposition to think about what could actually be in these empty glass vitrines, or what could have occupied this grand space, so that was something that we were definitely fascinated with. And so some of the things that that I showed you in the slides was, of course, part of the museum, but there were also a whole bunch of other objects and other elements that we were also thinking about another exercise that we did was to look at the Fort Museum in Chennai, which is again a very interesting colonial museum. It documents the colonial history in Chennai, and again a museum that is a very it resonates to a very personal kind of experience, and a lot of the objects have a very personal narrative as well. And I think I particularly sort of was thinking about the Fort Museum in many ways. So we did a couple of exercises with the Fort Museum, and so we were also in a sense thinking about the actual objects that are there. Like for example, there was one student from Kumbakonam. So she had done a series of paintings on pot shreds, for example. So the idea of broken pottery or collected. So there's also a group of students who collected different fabric or different clothes from people who are doing hard labor. So we had also displayed a series of fabric, and so in a sense to think about what a museum would usually have. I mean, we would of course have grand narratives, things that we would all want to be proud of, or, this is usually what museums would sort of, the space of a museum would occupy. But for us, it was stories that have been marginalized or stories that have been hidden, and then how do we sort of acknowledge, or how do we bring these stories into a public discussion, or something that we were thinking about. And again, in many ways, these are not stories that were outside of the group that was engaging with it. So it was from their personal spaces. It was objects and material that they were bringing from their own families and their own local environments.
Right. I thought I would take quickly one question that's come up. Can I unmute somebody? I mean, if they just have the name Galaxy J7, I don't have a name. I might just read out the question if they're not able to unmute themselves. They ask, how did those laborers whose stories and images were documented and exhibited in a totally different space react or respond to the process? I think Galaxy J7, you're unmuted. Do you want to ask the question yourself?
This is actually Blaze.
Oh, hi.
Yes, Blaze.
You've read the question, no? That's enough.
Okay. Who's asking, how did these stories, the laborers whose stories you documented and exhibited, and exhibited in a different space, react or respond to the process? Did you show them the result of the process? And if so, how did they respond to it? What were some of the striking conversations that happened?
Right. So one example for this is the Bust of Revati, which way before it came into the exhibition space itself was actually taken to the central station, a very open public space, and it was exhibited there. And of course it was it was in many ways sort of a point of discussion, or it was a point where a lot of conversations started. But I think on the whole, with the larger question, we don't know if we fully engaged with this question. So again, I think my only thing would be that the students and the stories that they were bringing to the project were not very different, in the sense it was largely their own stories. So it was largely their own parents, their immediate families. So in that sense, it was it's not. In fact, the project actually questions the whole anthropological study, or the viewing from an anthropological position of going into a space and documenting, and coming out and then without, or maybe with a relationship. So we were trying to think through these, and so I don't know if we've fully gone through the process of taking these works towards a more public space, where the laborers who were part of the project actually had their views documented in that sense. We've not, I don't think we've done that, but in many ways, these stories are not fully outside of the people who were engaging or creating these artworks in many ways. Yeah.
Another thing that is particularly, I think, important to me is to sort of know this sort of central position that the College of Art sort of had in the visual culture of the city itself. You know, there were numerous structures that were actually built. Like the College of Art was actually a brick factory, if I'm not wrong, before they moved into the space. So they were actually producing bricks to the extent that most of what was built at that time was built from the bricks here. And even the sort of the aesthetic quality of what could have been called a hybrid style of, education. It wasn't the traditional design that sort of made it to it, but it sort of had a particular aesthetic which informed not only public buildings in the city, but also private housing at that time, which, a lot of Britishers were building houses inside the city. And that's actually really interesting to sort of look at this deep relationship the college had with industry in the city. Apparently I can't remember the name of it. I think it's called the aluminum industry, was actually set up after the setting up of the department, aluminum work in the metalwork department. So this is, a College of Art, to think of a College of Art as changing the industrial landscape of the city is perhaps a little unimaginable right now. How can we sort of imagine relocating the where art stands today within the city? Because that's a question I'm very invested in, to sort of see, okay, the visual arts is something that sort of has a profound and sort of deep history with the city and its people. But, a sort of, it's also been something that's marginalized. It's something that we are able to live without acknowledging anymore. How do we sort of think about, the artists and the kind of impact that they can have within the city, and sort of reimagine how the College of Art, and not necessarily as College of Art, but as a group of artists, work within the city space?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, actually, it's a very interesting point, no? Which is that the College of Arts in many ways was really, it played a crucial role in building the city's aesthetics in many ways, and the Indo-Sasanic architecture and the ornamental elements that sort of were sort of placed in the Indo-Sasanic architecture as well. And I think the question of socially artists working within this space. So we actually have a very interesting history of artists who've sort of contributed to the regional narrative. Be it the Dravidian political trajectories, and of course with D.P. Roy Chowdhury, the question of the idea of freedom, the idea of nation building, and he was very much part of that discussion as well. So, but I think over the years, this has been a struggle, and in fact, I think I would imagine that maybe this is a time when a lot of young artists are also sort of coming together and then speaking about or having these similar kind of discussions that you are bringing up, which is how do we connect to a larger social engagement, and in many ways for young artists to become a liberal artist, or be it a studio based artist, or to create contemporary objects. It's definitely a struggle. It's definitely a question whether it's even something that will help them sustain themselves is a definitely a deep question, and in fact I think a lot of artists do not make that choice, or a lot of young people, I mean even within the Labor Project, a lot of very interesting young people were working within it, but then so immediate societal, financial, economic circumstances sort of trap them into taking this forward in many ways, so they're not able to make these choices. So of course, I mean, one would also question the state and the state's investment in the institution, and what the state is actually doing towards constructively supporting the school is something that definitely, and this question has several layers. It's not just a single layered kind of question, where it starts from who the teachers are within the institution, who comes in, who goes out, and then what as I was telling you about the syllabus, what are we imagining the future of it is, of course, I mean, I am particularly talking about the College of Arts. I mean, but the larger question of the city and the artists coming together in the city is also something that I think over the years there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of struggle to find one's voice. So and particularly with the institution, I would definitely think about the state's role and what the state can actually do. So for example, the art and culture department, or so we of course had what was called as the Ovia Nunkalai Kuru, and so the Ovia Nunkalai Kuru was a very important organization that supported a lot of artists, and so they had a bilingual journal. For the longest time it was being published, and it was called Nunkalai, and this journal even today stands as an important document that has a lot of interesting material to be looked at, so, and these have just been dropped over the years, and one doesn't fully understand why these shifts have happened, but I'm hoping that, and I think the time now is also interesting because a lot of artists have come together to discuss these questions, discuss the question of the syllabus, discuss the question of, what kind of future art space do we need, but I think this requires a deeper, longer engagement before we think about how, otherwise for most parts, artists, I think, are largely isolated from what we call as a social public realm within the city itself. Yeah.
That's a lot to think about. Thank you. Yeah. Another question from one Praveen Vijay Kumar. Praveen, would you like to ask the question? Praveen? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Hey.
Yeah. So hi, thank you both. Thank you, Krishnapriya, for your talk, and thank you, Bhooma, for moderating. So my question, I'll read it out. Is there an interest to engage with more of such spaces and persons and occupations? This project has clearly made visible a lot of social histories we otherwise pay less attention to. And I think it also awards people in more ways than one. I mean, people being people employed at places like the railway station, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So the thing is, I don't think there are too many such initiatives in that sense, no? But because it's even for us as artists, it's been quite a struggle to find our own space to articulate our or our views, and particularly when there's a shift in how we're imagining art, imagining our own practice, or imagining the narratives that we want to bring into a public discussion. I think increasingly this struggle is definitely there, and unfortunately, I mean, I think these spaces have only they've been shrinking more than they've been expanding, so and I think that calls for a lot from us as artists and from as cultural producers, creative thinkers, to think of ways in which we can actually expand on this space that we have. And we are also in that sense in very difficult times where, even the small liberal spaces that we have are fast shrinking. So, I mean, for me, I think it's also, it's it's a call out to a lot of other people who want to be actively involved in engaging with this question and expanding and finding new and creative ways to bring these discussions into the fabric of the city, not just the city, but I think as a larger narrative, because I think today in multiple ways we are all interconnected, and we're able to build parallel narratives across, so then how do we take these discussions forward is something that we all need to think about for sure. Yeah.
May I just jump in there and say one of the things that Krishnapriya and company, because she's always working with a whole group of people, has successfully done is actually continuously bring together a core group of people who can work and think together. And I think that's such an essential part of artistic practice today, of research of any kind. And I think that is something that's definitely, a way to go. If we were to do something like this, it's because there are people sort of working in the individual pockets, researchers working in American universities who are looking at the College of Art in Chennai, but no one here really coming up with something as comprehensive as that. Perhaps a more sort of concerted effort of coming together to sort of listen more carefully to the various people who have built this institution, who are continually sort of engaging with the history of visual culture in the city, and to sort of see how you can work together, because you have all these factions within the city itself, including the College of Art and Cholamandalam. And it's perhaps a little idealistic, but it's definitely a place to start, to sort of imagine a space where you can come together and actually talk about these various sort of issues of what it would need, what would we need to sort of also inspire art students to sort of continue in that path beyond employment, or beyond employability, to sort of continue practicing and also working in research like you have, and to sort of see it as a feasible way of going forward and, exploring it as an artistic process. There is one other question. Would you like to take that? Mr. Ganeshan Loganathan, why do you not allow other state artists to run the Kalaikuru? I don't know if that's a question that you can answer, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, right now, I don't know if the Nunkarai Kuru does not stand anywhere. I mean, it right now is not a functional body in many ways. So, yeah, I mean, I would also welcome diversity in that sense, I mean, I think we, over the years have, so we have to find ways of negotiating and diversifying, and then, bringing constructive discussions, being it with the government, or as individuals, or as collective outside of institutional spaces as well. So yeah.
Okay, I don't think I have any more questions or anything to sort of lead. If anybody has any questions, we'd like to take that now. Else, I'd like to bring an end to today's session. Thank you, Krishnapriya. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. It's always very interesting to go back and look at the same project over a period of time. I think this is the third time I've heard you present on it, and every time there's new things to think about, and small steps that you have taken from the previous phase of presenting. And I really hope the project sort of continues something more. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Bhooma. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Bhooma and Krishnapriya, for a truly wide-ranging discussion, which also encompassed the social history of Chennai and so many other elements. And so this definitely means that we need more, much more discussions on these various layers that you said. But thank you all. Thanks to all the participants, and thanks once more. Bye.